Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and GIFTS IIG insiders. Today, GIFTS gives you yet another thought-provoking insight session in partnership with the Insurance Institute of Gauteng, and that is corporate bullying. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me such great pleasure of introducing you to Simphiwe Mtshali, the current president of the Insurance Institute of Gauteng. Ladies and gentlemen, Simphiwe was the first employee at Howden Broking South Africa. She sees herself as a true product of the caliber of individuals that this industry can produce when education meets opportunity. She believes that no matter how small, our incremental contributions all add up. And as a new mum, her exercise regime has been placed on pause as she tried to find her feet, balancing motherhood and her career ambitions. Simphiwe, I can completely relate with that statement. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to now hand over to the very beautiful Simphiwe Mtshali. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Morning, Christina. Morning to everyone on the call. I have since transitioned from my maiden surname Mtshali to Magangane, my marital surname, so a slight change there. But it's an absolute pleasure to be on the Thought Leadership online session this morning. It is an IIG Insight session that's hosted in conjunction with the Graduate Institute of Financial Services. The gifters always have such a unique way of finding insight sessions topics, and today is no different. They continue to break the mold. I'm sure at some point in your career, you may have been in a conversation where someone may have flippantly said, you have to have a thick skin to be in corporate, or corporate is not for sissies. Could it be that in trying to teach individuals to become more resilient, or in how to navigate company politics or power dynamics or personalities at the office, we are actually perpetuating and at times unintentionally a culture of corporate bullying? We are possibly building an environment where individuals are filled with fear, with anxiety, and they feel isolated, which then negatively impacts their productivity, their mental health, and just really their overall well-being. Today, as Christina has mentioned, we are taking a deep dive into corporate bullying. And we have been blown away by the number of registrations for today's session. It seems that there is a lot of interest in trying to understand this topic. Please remember to stay on the call for the duration of the session for you to earn your CPD points. So without any further delay, Christina, it's back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much for that, Simphiwe. Ladies and gentlemen, if 2023 has shown us one thing, it's that the world is in need of dedicated, visionary servant leaders. And our next speaker, who is the host of this session, Dr. Kirshan Pillay, is one of them. He's the CEO of the Graduate Institute of Financial Sciences, otherwise known as GIFS. He became a CEO at the age of 27 and has rebranded the organization into the financial services education powerhouse that it is today. Kirshen holds pride of place in the financial services sector as a thought leader and innovator. Under his stewardship, GIFS has carved a reputation for the commitment to building a better Africa for others to inherit, and thousands of learners have been empowered through the power of education. Ladies and gentlemen, it's no wonder that GIFS has been a finalist or winner in 10 education-related award categories over the past few years, and Kirshen was named the TYI Top 100 Young African Innovators of 2018, and has also notched up a string of his own awards and accolades during his 14 years in the financial services sector. Ladies and gentlemen, before I hand the virtual microphone to Dr. Kirshen Pillay, please may you assist me in helping Dr. Kirshen and GIFS for winning the Future of Work Visionary Awards as voted by 250 South African leaders last week. Ladies and gentlemen, please may we see those virtual claps going. Please may we see all of those congratulations in the box, because this is such an amazing, amazing accolade. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, and without further ado, Dr. Kirshen Pillay, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. Isaac Asimov said, and I paraphrase, "There is a cult of ignorance around us. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political, cultural, social, and professional lives. Nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Today, there is a widely known syndrome called the Dunning-Kruger syndrome, which unfortunately plagues many of our boardrooms today. So what is this Dunning-Kruger syndrome? The Dunning-Kruger syndrome, or effect, occurs when incompetent people not only fail to realize their incompetence, but consider themselves much more competent than everyone else. And I'll leave the last line for you to read. This syndrome has given rise to toxic work environments and the loss of talented resources. Despite our high unemployment rates in South Africa, the phrase coined by Anthony Koltz, SA2 has been captured by the Great Resignation, with many talented professionals refusing to tolerate corporate bullying. Recent headlines clearly show our corporate bullying is on a rise, and through changing legislation, the bullies and their companies are now at risk. Meaning, if you are a bully, or if you are in an organization that knowingly or unknowingly lets it slide, let's just say the consequences of ignoring this is no longer child's play. Good morning, IIG insiders. It's great to have you join us once again. Today, we are going to chat to you and bring together people from both the legal and the HR fraternity to shed some light and insight on this matter. They are going to tell us about matters that have reached court, how to identify if you are being bullied, or if you are in fact that bully, and what are the possible recourses available for both the organization and the victims of bullying. Today, we are honored and privileged to have with us on panel a very well-known and highly revered human capital executive. She's known for advocating for the human being and not the human bot, with over 2 decades of HR experience in various executive roles at ABSA, OMI, and RMB, to name a few. Please help me welcome the CEO and co-founder of Brainwave Communications, Ms. Sangeeta Prasad, who holds a degree in social sciences as well as a Bachelor of Laws, together with many other qualifications from renowned institutes like MIT and the London Business School. Welcome, Sangeetha. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Kirshen, and thank you to GIFS and IIG for welcoming me onto the platform to talk about this very prevalent topic of corporate bullying.
Great. We look forward to hearing more from you later on. Our next panelist is South Africa's very own Harvey Specter. We are also privileged to have with us Mr. Muzi Khoza, an executive at one of Africa's largest law firms, joining us from Edwin Nathan Sonnenberg, Africa. Muzi Khoza, who specializes in labor law litigation and various aspects of workplace procedures. He represented clients at the CCMA, the Labour Courts, the High Court, and the Supreme Court of South Africa. He has acted on behalf of a number of clients in both the public and private sector and many industries across South Africa. Help me welcome this award-winning lawyer and a friend to GIFS who always is willing to give us his time. Muzi, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Kirshen. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to participating in this very important session. Thank you.
And now to our most valuable individuals on this call. It's you, our IIG insiders. As an audience, we know you love to communicate, so please keep those chats going. Share your thoughts, experience, and comments with us so we can address some of your burning issues. Now let's dive straight into this burning topic. And Sangeetha, I'd like to start with you. What is corporate bullying? And how widespread is this problem of corporate bullying within South Africa?
Thank you, Kirshen, for the question. Corporate bullying is a range of behaviors. It's anything that is demeaning, intimidating, and behavior that lowers the self-esteem of another human being. The question on how widespread it is, it's unfortunately very widespread and very prevalent. We've seen a steep increase in corporate bullying over the last 2 years, and unfortunately that is coming out of the pandemic. Being an HR practitioner on the ground daily in corporate, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that almost every week I've been investigating cases of corporate bullying. It's very prevalent, it's very rife, and unfortunately, many human beings are not conscious of the behavior that they display at the workplace. What I'm saying to you is corroborated by our employee wellness stats, which in many financial institutions, our service provider would be ICAS. And if at any given point you draw the stats from ICAS on mental health and mental wellness, you'll see over the last 2 periods that there's been a steep increase in the reported cases of mental health deteriorating amongst our workforce. So much so that this has now become a legal issue, which Muzi is going to speak about. We've seen the introduction of the Code of Good Practice as it talks about the prevention and elimination of harassment in the workplace just last year. That in and by itself tells us that there is a problem in South Africa as it relates to corporate bullying.
Sangeetha, thank you for this. It's very alarming to hear that there is weekly occurrences. So the frequency is obviously high. It's supported by data by institutions like ICAS, and we see legislative reform in place to try and curb this or prevent it to the introduction of the Code of Good Practice and Conduct. So Sangeetha, please can you share some examples of what you've encountered so people are aware of how to identify if they are becoming a victim of corporate bullying or if they are in fact corporate bullies themselves supporting this toxic work environment?
Kirshen, if you've been in corporate as long as I have, as you rightly stated, over 2 decades, typically we would have put corporate bullying down to the infamous email. You know, those ones where you get shouted at with caps lock and exclamation marks, etc. That was really, what we grew up in corporate experiencing as corporate bullying, so to say. And there were rather blasé statements, if we were talking amongst each others as colleagues, like, oh, that guy is just such a bully, or that female is such a bully, etc. We'd brush it off. But over the last 2 years, we have seen that we simply cannot do that. Why? Because people are experiencing a deterioration in their health, a deterioration in their relationships. But if you bring it back to the workplace, a deterioration in how they work, where they work, how they experience relationships in corporate. How do we experience bullying in corporate at the moment? So it is those snide remarks that you consistently hear. So that would be gossip. It would be where we bully each other in the form of using vulgar language. So where we don't respect each other's upbringing, each other's culture, we speak the way we want to. It's forms of aggression as well. You know, we bang our hands on the table when we speak, we storm out of the office, etc. Behavior that doesn't have any decorum in corporate or in the office. It's openly insulting people for where they are, or who they are, where they come from, their backgrounds, what they're doing, what they know, what they don't know, how educated they are, or how uneducated they are, to your earlier statement, which you didn't want to speak about. And two latest trends we see that's cropping up, and we hear this a lot on social media, is ghosting and gaslighting. It's where people deliberately manipulate you without knowing that you are being manipulated. And those are just some of the examples that I can cite, which is easy to identify in corporate or the workplace. If I actually put that down to tangible examples, I'll give you an example of a case I worked on over the last few months or year or so. It was a social media case. It was a male employee who decided to go onto a female employee's Facebook page, her Instagram account, and all of her social media accounts, right? And he started to observe certain behaviors. And he came back to the office and started reporting on the female colleagues' daily occurrences or what she did in the weekend, and then amounted her behavior, and I'll quote unquote, as she is a loose one, right? And this now obviously leaked out into the workplace, and people started to brandish our female employee in a negative way, right? And we use slanderous comments like, she dresses like this, or, she's a slut or a tart, or whatever the case is. And she was very aggrieved by this, and rightfully so, and raised this complaint to me directly, in fact. And when I investigated it, I mean, we obviously don't have any control over anybody's social media accounts. And we do say upfront when we do employ people to just be very wary of what they post. But we didn't have control over that. And we had to then take the party, the male colleague, through a disciplinary grievance hearing in order to discipline him for the behavior that he displayed in the workplace and for bringing a female colleague's reputation into disrepute. And he could have been fired, but we let him off on a final written warning. And these are just one of the things that I experience on a daily basis, and so does my teams that I've worked with. And a lot of it is very serious. A lot of it can be seen as random comments, and we can let go on warnings. But I do need to let the teams know on the call that we've also dismissed people for bullying in the workplace.
Sangeeta, thank you very much for that. And we can't just take things that are said in jest lightly anymore. We need to look at what are the underlying factors. And I'm just looking on the chat here. There's two questions that have been put up, which I feel are interlinked. One comment was, what happens if the corporate bully is someone in a managerial position? And one is afraid of being victimized if they speak up. And then we have Pramita, who's gone on to say, would corporate bullying be the underlying factor for quiet quitting? And if you look at what the unknown user has now said, that you're too afraid to say anything, and Pramita talks about the quiet quitting. Do you want to shed some light on that and any stats on it, if you may have any, or examples?
Yeah, so I'd like to answer the first question first, right? So on victimization and anonymity and reporting corporate bullying. There's a number of ways that you can report corporate bullying, right? Number one, I would say, is before you actually report it, is to confront the bully himself or herself directly. That's what I've done. I've also experienced corporate bullying in my 2 decades of being in corporate. And what I find is through that behavior, the individual who's actually the bully is not so aware of the fact that they are bullying you. They don't actually know what it means, and they think they're just being themselves. And as Kirshen said, they are saying things in jest and it has no deeper meaning. So if you can, please speak to the bully directly. Take them for a coffee, try to understand where they're coming from, and let them see where you're coming from. I understand that that advice would not work for all people and all situations. In more serious circumstances where you feel you cannot speak to the bully directly, I would advise you to speak to your ethics line. The ethics line in all corporates are administered by third parties. To my knowledge, in most financial institutions, it's administered through Deloitte. I have dealt with many corporate bullying cases through the Deloitte hotline, and I have taken people through disciplinaries or I've addressed their behavior directly with them, purely on the basis that the person that complained remains anonymous. I've also dismissed people based on complaints that have come through the ethics hotline after I investigated cases and still maintained to keep the anonymity of the complainant. There are many ways that we can do that. To the second questions that Pranita had asked on quiet quitting, I don't think corporate bullying is directly linked to quiet quitting. Quiet quitting, as I've seen through the last sort of 18 months, happens when you are actually not engaged in your workplace, you don't find your work stimulating, you're not happy with the teams that you're in, you don't like going into the office, so when you get there, you just sort of withdraw. When somebody is actively being bullied, they will either leave, as Kirshen had mentioned earlier, or they will make some noise around it by complaining, or they'll rally their teams or colleagues that support them in order to bring the bully to book. So more often than not, quiet quitting won't be associated largely with corporate bullying.
Sangeeta, thank you very much for that. And I'm looking at the chats and I see there's a theme going on here, like Debbie is mentioning that, you know, when it's the leader that is the one that is doing the bullying, it's very difficult to rise up to that and not see yourself out of it. So thank you for sharing alternative mechanisms like the hotlines available. And it's also very sad to see, like, Leonie has shared an experience. So thank you, Leonie, for sharing your experience so openly with us, where she was, a victim of bullying or seen something like that. And then to make sure that we answer the question that is brought through by Neetha. Muzi, I want to now segue to you. Following on from what Sangeeta says, I'd like some insight, especially since you've represented many people and many organizations at various levels in relation to corporate bullying and harassment, and how serious these consequences are to both the organization and these corporate bullies, if found guilty of bullying or if found guilty of concealing it. Can you share some precedents with us and the processes that have reached to seeing these matters arrive at court? So, Muzi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kirshen. I think some context is necessary here. So, as Sangeeta said, the concept of corporate bullying, or the practice itself, it's something that has been there for so many years in South Africa. But as the concept of corporate bullying as a workplace misdemeanor, it has only recently been recognized in our law. In the Code of Good Practice that Sangeeta referred to, which was published by the Department of Employment and Labor during the course of last year. So in our law, corporate bullying is recognized as a form of harassment, and harassment itself, in terms of the Employment Equity Act, is recognized as a form of unfair discrimination. So the whole concept of corporate bullying, what it does, it offends the principle of equality. Now, from an organization point of view, all employers have a legal duty in terms of the Employment Equity Act to eliminate all forms of unfair discrimination. And as I have said, harassment and corporate bullying are forms of unfair discrimination. And you've got to take all reasonable steps to ensure that you do so. the code requires the employers to have, in fact, a harassment policy in place that outlines the procedures that those who are complaining about harassment, including corporate bullying, must follow. And it's an elaborate process, but essentially, and also imposing an obligation on the employer to offer the appropriate assistance to the complainants of corporate bullying. Now, directly to your question as to the consequences for the bullies and the organization, it's clear now, because of the provisions of the Employment Equity Act and the Code of Good Practice, that corporate bullying is a form of serious misconduct, because it results in the impugning of the dignity of those against whom it is perpetrated. It results in a hostile working environment against them. So it is a serious misconduct. If anyone is found guilty of it, then most certainly, unless exceptional circumstances are present, there should be a termination of that employment relationship. Also, as a means of fulfilling the employer's obligations, because a corporate bully to one person will bully other people as well. So as a preventative measure, there should be a termination of that employment. Now, with regards to the consequences, they are twofold. What we have seen, there is a practical one, which Singita has alluded to as well, which is if employees feel that they could be bullied at work and no consequences are there for the bullies, then people will leave, and then you're going to lose the critical skills that any organization needs. And that is followed by the issue of reputation. The organization has a very bad reputation, that the working environment there is not a healthy one. And that is one of the negative for the employer. And the second one is a legal one. As I said, the very concept of corporate bullying itself has not been distinctly recognized for some time, but it has always been dealt with as a form of harassment. Now, in the context of the employment relations, we have seen so the corporate bullying can take two forms, either horizontal or vertical. The vertical one happens as in between subordinate and manager, and some of it happens just between employees at the same level. What we have seen, a growing number of cases where managers abuse their positions. In many organizations, the payment of bonuses, an issue that will be relevant to many of us here. The payment of bonuses is dependent on the performance scores, and the managers are directly responsible for allocating the performance scores and performance appraising the employees. And you would find very bad behavior by managers who seek to abuse their coercive power on the employees, in the knowledge that if the employee were to stand up for their rights, what would happen is they know that they may be punished by the manager negatively performance appraising them, which then affects the allocation of bonuses. And we've seen such cases going all the way to the CCMA in the form of unfair labor practices, in that the employee would submit objective facts that show that on the objective facts, I shouldn't have gotten the performance appraisal that I got, and which then resulted in me either not getting a bonus or getting a lower than I deserved a bonus. So that's one of the consequences, because in the unfair labor practice, the CCMA is not going to issue an award against the perpetrator, but the award is issued against the employer, despite the fact that the manager was responsible for the mistreatment of the employee. So that is one of the negative consequences for the employer. But there is even more serious ones, which are contained within the provisions of the Employment Equity Act. And all employees should be aware of that when we are subjected to corporate bullying, which is a form of harassment. Now, in terms of the Employment Equity Act, if the employer is informed or alerted to a complaint of harassment, and the employer doesn't take effective steps to deal with that complaint and to take steps to eliminate the harassment, then in terms of the law, the employer is deemed to have committed that form of harassment, which means is what in law is known as vicarious liability, despite that a particular employee of the employer would have committed the bullying. If it can be shown that the bullying actually did take place, it was brought to the attention of the employer did not do anything about it, then that employer would be held liable for that. So as I've said, there is not many cases that have gone to court relating specifically to corporate bullying, but the precedent that emanates from the labor court and the high court in relation to other cases of harassment, as I have said, bullying is just another form of harassment. We have shown that there are instances where employers have been ordered to pay millions to the employees who were harassed at the workplace in circumstances where it is shown that the employer did not take appropriate measures. So for the employees, what is important is to know, as Sangita has said, when they are subjected to corporate bullying, those unfavorable jokes and insinuations about one's career progression if they do not submit to certain demands. And for the employer, they have to make sure that they've got appropriate policies in place that regulates this issue, that sets out clear procedures, what employees should do. And when these are brought to the attention of the employer, timeous action should be taken to eliminate that conduct and deal with the alleged perpetrators, failing which the employer then or the organization is exposing itself to the reputational damage that comes with being known as tolerating a toxic work environment, or from a legal point of view, the financial exposure is massive, as shown by the recent cases emanating from the Labour Court and the High Court. And I must say there are examples. In fact, there is one of the leading cases arising out of the CCMA, I think, a high-profile one, a professor at a University of the Witwatersrand, who was a head of a department there. He ran what is known as, became to be known at the arbitration as a boys' club. And despite the fact that they were not making their actions clear, but the female academic staff in that department, they were dealt with as non-entities. It was clear that if you are not part of the boys' club, your career progression is not going to go very well. You wouldn't be considered for acting positions. You wouldn't be considered for any of the interesting work within the department. And they were able to demonstrate this, and credit to Wits University. They constituted a process where that was investigated, and that professor was dismissed. And the CCMA found that the dismissal was fair to the extent that it was shown that his conduct, viewed as a whole, was such that it was humiliating and had the effect of impugning the dignity of the female staff who were treated less than their male colleagues.
Thank you very much for that. Very, very, very insightful. So Boys Club, be careful. But we also know that from what the chats are saying, that it's not only limited to men who are the bullies now. We are seeing in this chat that a large portion of females are also responsible. So it's not, it goes across the genders in terms of bullying and or corporate bullying. But I think what you've made very clear to us today is that corporate bullying under the South African laws have been legislated. It's taken more seriously because we have the Employment Equity Act, but we've also seen the introduction of the Conduct for Good Practices, which shows that the legislators are taking this very seriously. And what is of particular importance is for organizations and leaders that are present on today's call to say that if you become aware, witness, see corporate bullying in any way, shape, or form, you need to act on it. And you need to act on it fast and do so in a fair and concise manner because of vicarious liability that it poses. And Sangeeta, speaking to what you said, it obviously seems that it's not uncommon because there's a mix between what's happening in the professional lives and it's spilling into the personal lives. I've looked at a chat here that comes from a gentleman by the name of Manny Hadebe. And Manny says, how does one protect himself or herself against a group of bullies in a workplace who gang up against you outside of the workplace as well? That's quite scary.
It is very scary, and unfortunately, it's also not uncommon. So, what we're typically seeing is with our late born millennials and our Gen Zs entering the workplace now, they generally form cliques, because they're in their 20s, early 30s, etc. And generally, when you have cliques in the workplace, it spills out into your social lives as well. My advice to many and to others that are experiencing such instances where the bullying then spills over into your personal time is, number one, to document everything that is happening, right? Once you document this, it's not only a form of catharsis because you've actually written it down, but it also gives any sort of mediator in the case or any chairperson a day by day or moment by moment breakdown of what you as Manny is experiencing and what the bullies are doing to you by word and by action, because you've written everything down. This then forms the basis of the evidence that you are going to submit. Because largely what happens in corporate bullying cases, it often becomes a he said and she said situation, and you want to avoid that. And it's worked very well when I've advised other employees to do so. Write down exactly what you're experiencing, because you need to be very cognizant of the fact that corporates have top of mind your mental health and wellness. And the moment those things are mentioned in the workplace, we all sort of sit up and go, okay, this is having a wider impact. What's also important to note is that bullying doesn't only impact you as the individual. It impacts the people that you work with. But more importantly, and unfortunately, it also impacts your family. So as Kirshen and Muzi mentioned, corporates do need to take swift action in nipping this in the bud and dealing with the perpetrator as soon as this comes to the attention. Writing down and forming a body of evidence is extremely important and critical in order to prove what it is that you are saying and to prevent the he said, she said scenario.
Sangeeta, thank you very much for that. And going over to our next question, I want you to provide some advice because you've covered most of it. But I see Ashley has also mentioned this in her in the chat. Most people are aware of the HR function at work, and it has seemed to always favor the corporate. And what happens if you are constantly informing HR? And Muzi has spoken about what's the consequences to the employer from a harassment perspective, but what further guidance can you give? What advice can you give to people caught up in an environment of corporate bullying, where it seems that it's favored towards the corporate partner or the employer in this case?
It's unfortunate for me, Kirshen, when employees reach the point where they no longer can trust the human capital function. Of course, I take that very personally, and I hope never to have a function like that. But be that as it may, we do find ourselves sometimes in the situation where we do take the side of the corporate as opposed to the employee. There are a couple of things I'd like to advise employees on and perhaps answer your question in a twofold manner. Number one, when you experience any form of bullying or harassment, as Muzi has mentioned, you need to look after yourself first, right? You need to after your mental health, your own mental wellness. Why? Because your behavior and the way you are feeling impacts the people around you, and it impacts your family. And without you knowing it or without you saying anything, the people that love you the most will feel the impact of what you're going through, even without knowing the details. So self-care and self-love is of utmost importance. And therefore, I'd say when you go through a situation like this, please speak to your employee wellness service provider. Like I said, in most cases, this would be ICAS, but I do believe that there has been new service providers that have been added to the list. So looking after yourself would be the most important thing for me, because ultimately your well-being determines how far you're going to go in your career in whatever corporate you are in. The second thing is the more formal routes. So the more tangible things that you can do to address bullying in the workplace. As I mentioned earlier, my advice, and it's worked for me as well, is to always address the bully face to face, right? Take them out for a cup of coffee, say this is how you're feeling, what is the person going through. More often than not, you'll find that bullies are unaware of their behavior. They don't even know what they are doing is bullying, right? If you think about kids, or when we were kids, or if you have kids in school at the moment, right, that are being bullied, and when you address a bully in the school, you'll often find that there's something going on in the bully's home. Their parents are getting divorced. There is some, trauma that is happening. There's death or something, and that bullying and that that trauma plays out in bullying at schools. And if you don't solve the problem of the bully at school, that problem then becomes the adult bully in the workplace. And therefore, I always say, speak to the bully first. But again, like I said earlier, I know it's not easy, and perhaps it's not the first thing that you want to do. The second thing is obviously looking at your ethics and whistleblowing hotlines. Typically, what we have done in corporate whistleblowing hotlines were introduced to report fraudulent matters. Over the last 2-3 years, I'd say that whistleblowing hotline or ethics hotline has been taken over with cases of employer-employee behavior, corporate bullying, a whole lot of instances that really become ER issues that we need to deal with as a human capital function. What's nice about the whistleblowing and ethics hotline is that it's administered by a third party, so your anonymity is absolutely preserved. Your complaint is not shared with anybody. So the investigation happens, we report it back to Deloitte in this instance, or the example that I'm using, and they facilitate the mediation between the employee and the corporate. So that's also a very safe zone for you to use. If you want to go more formal, and if you feel you are up to a formal process, of course, your internal resolution processes in your company is there to assist you, and that generally is by lodging a grievance. You do need to be aware that, let's say, a chairperson is selected to chair the grievance, and if you are not happy with that chairperson because you feel that they are not impartial, you could ask for a reconvening of that chairperson or the case, so that you are satisfied that the person that is going to be adjudicating the matter is in fact going to be impartial and listen to both sides of the story before making a decision. And of course, the last point, which Muzi will unpack further, is the option to still remain employed in your company, but to lodge a complaint with the CCMA. I'll hand over to Muzi to unpack that a little bit more, but those are really your dispute resolution mechanisms that you could follow. But again, I want to reiterate to look after yourself first. Self-love and self-care is of utmost importance when you're going through something like this. Thanks, Kershin.
Thank you very much. So we're hearing the theme self-love and fill your glass first, which seems to be the advice given. And I'm reading the chats, and thank you once again, IIG Insiders, for being so open and vulnerable and sharing your thoughts with us. And what we're coming to see is more often than not, the HR manager and the person who's the bully are friends, which creates some level of bias. We're finding that the people that are actually doing the bullying are senior managers and people. Also, I saw a comment from, I think it was Leslie Kun, Kesley Kun, who basically said that you sometimes even feel intimidated to go and approach this individual and have that coffee with them. So Muzi, I just want to go to you now. When employees feel that they've exhausted all internal remedies, there are many options that are advertised where you sign up and pay for access to labor lawyers. Is it important to have legal representation on standby? Or what exactly should you do when things aren't going as you would like in the workplace, and you have, and you believe that you have exhausted all the internal functions?
Yeah, Heshan, I would strongly advise that. I think the first step is for one to be sure that they have, in fact, exhausted all internal remedies. It may happen in some instances that the facts of the case are such as the example that you gave of the bully being friends with the HR manager, which is very an undesirable situation. Then in that instance, that the employee can't do anything. But very often, employees, they would rush to engage lawyers who start writing letters to the company. And I must say, in many instances, the employer is the company, the entity that employs you. And then they will put a manager who must manage you. And the manager then does what they do. And that is not sanctioned by the employer. Now, the lawyer's letters, in my experience, are not viewed in a very positive light. And even people who would be very sympathetic to the employee, they take a negative view of it. So by all means, to have legal advice is important. Take legal advice, but on internal processes, if one can first trust the internal processes, follow those processes, unless it's clear that you can't, then once you have exhausted the internal processes, then the next process is to refer the matter to the CCMA and other bodies that may have jurisdiction. In particular, I know in the public service, the Office of the Public Protector, for instance, would have jurisdiction over those entities, but not over all the entities. So that option to refer a matter to the CCMA is always there. And in experience, it has shown that once so referred, the employers, even the ones who were not taking it seriously, when it was being dealt with internally, they take a more serious view of it, and particularly because of the exposure that I have mentioned earlier, that the employer might be found directly responsible for that kind of harassment. So by all means, to answer your question, to get advice from the lawyers or the HR consultants, that is important because it enables you to know your rights and to identify all the conduct that may infringe your rights. But I would strongly advise against involving lawyers in internal processes prematurely. But there is that next step that you have once you have exhausted the internal processes, refer the matter to the CCMA. The CCMA will conciliate it. In some instances, they have the power to actually arbitrate it and issue a binding arbitration award. In some instances, you must, after conciliation, then refer the matter to the labor court, who will adjudicate the matter, particularly where the discriminate, where the harassment constitute unfair discrimination.
Musi, thank you for that. I think what I'm hearing you say is that the legal route is often not well received when you start this litigious process between yourself and your employer, and rather get legal advice separately but independently, but utilize all the internal remedies and then move over to the CCMA should you feel your matter is not being resolved. But I want to ask you the question, how realistic and practical is it for someone to have their matter proceed to the CCMA, particularly in avenues of bullying, like or harassment?
Yeah. So the first issue is from an internal point of view. So the code of good practice that we referred to earlier has some elaborate processes about the harassment policy that the employers must put in place, and the procedures that must be followed once the employee has reported the bullying. One of those is they have built into the code of good practice what the policy must deal with itself, and that is very important because it just shows that the drafters of the code of good practice did appreciate that in some instances there may be weaknesses within the systems of the employer, and then they put in the guidelines that the policy must deal with. So in terms of those processes, there is two processes that could be followed, either an informal one or a formal one. If on the employer's own investigation, it is clear that other people may also stand a risk of the same complaint that has been lodged, then a formal process should be followed, which is a grievance process, which must be dealt with internally. Whatever the outcome of that grievance process is, because of the primacy of the rights that are conferred by the legislation, it's always practical. There is always the avenue for the employee to refer a matter to the CCMA. So the CCMA would never say, but you have not exhausted the internal remedies, so we can't deal with your matter. They can't say that because the right to refer the matter to the CCMA is unqualified in the legislation. So dealing with the matter internally is a practical one, which helps because you could actually resolve it domestically. It's not all employers that are going to tolerate bullying, but by going and fighting with everyone without giving the employer the opportunity to deal with the matter, you may actually turn them against you as well, because they see you as if you are fighting with everyone, whereas they would have stood with you in fighting with the bully. But as I say, it's always realistic to have your matter go to the CCMA. You will never be met with an argument that says you haven't exhausted the internal processes, because the right of access to the CCMA when you are being harassed is not qualified in any way.
Musi, thank you very much for that. I don't know where the time has gone. We've got 9 minutes left. It's such an interesting conversation. But Sangeeta, I'm reading through the chats and I'm picking up a very common thread here. And I just want to allude to something we chatted about earlier, the Dunning-Kruger syndrome or the Dunning-Kruger effect, the levels of anti-intellectualism, and where you related it back to childhood, where often a bully is someone who's trying to mask or hide something. Do you think that bullying is occurring in the workplace because the people that are actually doing the bullying maybe do not have the technical skills, the experience, the gravitas to hold the positions that they do, to be the leaders or to be the colleague that they are, and now are deflecting and using bullish and bullying tactics and using other people to gather the troops to, now try and say, hey, the problem is you and not me. I just would love to hear your thoughts on that from an HR perspective.
Thanks, Kirshen. That's a very relevant question, and I think somewhat of a controversial one, actually. More often than not, we have all grown up to believe or make believe that our leaders knew more than us. We should do as we are told and don't question the way we do things. And now with the entry of newer generations and youngsters coming into the workplace who can do things in a slick and seamless manner, and perhaps in a third of the time, we seem to not like it. Why? Because it means that actually we're not really relevant if somebody else can do the job better and faster. And yes, one of the repercussions of that is we start to act out on it, and in a way that is not conducive to a workplace where you can actually thrive or for all to thrive. So yes, the concept of anti-intellectualism is rife as well, because we are seeing that our younger generations might not necessarily have the degrees that we have, those of us that have been in corporate a long time, but what they do have is very relevant learning that they've acquired over short, sharp periods of time. And I always say short, sharp bursts of learning that equips them to do the job as they need to today. And if they're going to do something differently tomorrow, they will learn a different skill. It's very easy for them to pivot. And the older generations, the baby boomers, the X's, and the earlier born millennials are feeling rather threatened by this, because our jobs become redundant, because someone can do it quicker, someone can do it cheaper. There's obviously the threat of automation and AI and analytics that are coming in that also exacerbates the problem. So I think that, working today in corporate or any workplace is extremely difficult. Just doing the job and having to get through 8 hours a day is tough. And now you have these added layers that you need to deal with, which is obviously your mental wellness, the bullying, the fact that you just simply don't get on with colleagues because you're completely different. And we're no longer seeing each other and building human bonds because we are working virtually, and we simply cannot see what ticks us off and what keeps us ticking. And therefore, that also plays out in a form of bullying as well. Kirshen, if you don't mind, I just want to backtrack to one of the earlier points that one of the colleagues made on the line around female bullying. And, I read an article many years ago, I think it was 2014, 2015, where bullying really wasn't a big thing. And the article really related to how females behave in the workplace. And one of the paragraphs of that article was around female bullying. And what that article said was that when you experience a female bully in the workplace, more often than not, that female is a victim of some domestic violence at home. So there's two things a female would do, is that they would retreat within themselves if they are domestically abused. So they won't talk to anyone, they won't say anything, and they'll just get on with their day-to-day activities, or they will amplify their behavior or being verbal in the workplace, and that often plays out in some kind of behavior that is not conducive to a healthy working relationship. So I just wanted to make that point. So we spoke about trauma in the childhood, and that's when childhood bullies play out, but there's also trauma in adulthood that plays out at the workplace. And I just wanted to mention that interesting fact.
Thank you very much for that, Sangeeta. Muzi, I now want to go on to you and have your 60-second counter on to give us your 60-second sum up of what people need to take into consideration. And if you can align it to something that I've seen is very common, where people don't seem to respect the boundaries of others. So if you are working at 3 a.m. in the morning, you expect your colleague to be working at 3 a.m. in the morning. And give us your sum up and somehow allude to some of those comments that are put in by our IIG insiders. Your 60 seconds starts now, Muzi.
Thanks, Keshen. So what I can say in closing is, really since the introduction of the 9-hour work and 5-day work week, many of us spend our all adult life in the work environment. So that environment shouldn't be akin to hell. So what is important for the potential victims of corporate bullying is to know their rights. And secondly, because of the legislative measures that have been put in place to protect people against potential corporate bullying, is to speak up when this arises and to alert the employer. And I would go further and say, alert the employer also of the consequences of them not dealing with the issue adequately, that you will then be referring a dispute against the employer directly if they don't address your concerns, and that will spring them into action. Thank you.
Excellent, Muzi. And I think the word that I've taken out from today is from you is voracious liability. So if nothing else, use it and use it well, insiders. And Sangeeta, let's go over to you. Can you give us your 60-second sum up?
The pressure on 60 seconds, Kirshen, it's very seldom I can do things under pressure like this. But we often see memes or little sayings on Instagram, on LinkedIn. In a world where you can be anything, please be kind. And you often then see the circle, much like what is on the screen. And the circle really shades out, somebody's life. And then what you know about it is the dot. For me, I'm all about building human bonds and human relationships. When you are experiencing moments of adversity in the workplace, don't just send an email. Go for a coffee, go for a lunch. Those moments can change a person's life, even the person that is bullying you. So take a moment to rather build the relationship. We are human beings. We hunt in packs. We're successful as teams. We're successful as a group of people. And it's important for us to maintain the human contact with each other. So that's me in 60 seconds.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta. So there you have it. We are a social construct and a social community. Try the social approach first. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this dynamic dialogue. But I would like to leave you with this. We know that South Africa has a jobs crisis with rising unemployment rates and a faltering economy. Does this then mean that as South Africans, we should tolerate more than the average employee? Or are we not lauded for having some of the fairest labor practices in the world? So my question is, why do we allow corporate bullying to exist in a country where we should know better, especially considering our recent history? Once again, a special thank you to our panelists, Mrs. Sangeeta Surprasad, Mr. Muzi Khoza. Your insights have been invaluable. To the IIG and its president, Mrs. Simpiwe Mshali, and most importantly to you, our audience, you have been fantastic as always. Thank you for being a part of a conversation that matters and for helping us and the IIG break the mold. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.